Greetings everyone, I'm Cleo, Alberta Lake, and this is my Windrush story. Like many people with my particular heritage, which can be labelled in many ways, dual heritage, Black British, African Caribbean, African descent and African heritage, I'm all of those things. Sometimes there are gaps in our stories, and that's where we can be creative and try and fill those gaps. My story could start quite wide, but I'm trying to bring it in. Most of our stories are quite wide and go across the frame of this particular screen. My story starts briefly in the 19th century, somewhere around perhaps the 1840s, a time when, in much of the Caribbean, the practice of enslaving Africans had been finally outlawed and emancipation had come. Abolition, we could say. With that brought a new raft of people into countries like Jamaica, which is where part of my heritage is from. My father, who I describe as a proud African man born in Jamaica. Well, at that time, different people came over to Jamaica to continue with the backbreaking work of plantation work and other tasks. Some of these people were from countries like India. A significant number came over as what was termed indentured servants, but also people from Africa also came over under those terms as well, and from countries like Congo, which is Central Africa. As I said, my heritage is African Jamaican, and my father grew up and was born in the parish of St. Thomas, which is the furthermost corner of Jamaica and very close to the country Haiti or Haiti. My father grew up in Johnstown in rural St. Thomas. My father grew up in Johnstown, rural St. Thomas. And St. Thomas is known for many things. It's known for Morant Bay and the rebellion, and also for the practice of kumina, which has been described as the most Afrocentric practice on the island. Kumina combines different elements and has a very strong spiritual power and significance, and is a very good example of African retention. Kumina involves song, drumming, and dance. And researchers have claimed that much of the language used in the songs is not only what we would describe as patois, the kind of English version or Jamaican version of English, but it also includes dialect from Congo, which perhaps further reinforces the idea that this practice was a combination of enslaved Africans recently freed and newer Africans arriving as indentured servants, and these two cultures coming together. Instruments were also drums, shakers, and also scrapers, graters, and those kind of things. A combination of traditional items, traditional musical instruments, and things that could be found and made and adapted. The dance is particularly important within Kumina because it has the power allegedly to raise the dead and also give clarity on some big questions. So we can see that this practice combines elements of traditional Afrocentric religious practice, spiritual significance, relation to nature and the cosmos, and also a connection to spirits and ancestors. I understand that there may have been a culture clash within my father's family. My father went to America before he settled in the UK and settled in London before finally laying his roots in Bristol. I can remember meeting members of his family who also settled in the US, and I have relatives in High Point, North Carolina. I mention them because They were very, very religious and very much into the Pentecostal religion branch of Christianity, I should say. And I can remember going to funerals or prayer meetings when people were sick and being absorbed and fascinated by how these members of my family from Jamaica would practice their religion. They would often become absorbed and overwhelmed by the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, they would say, and they would talk in tongues and sometimes, start shouting and moving around quite ferociously, which was something that perhaps I wouldn't say scared me, but I thought was quite different growing up. But I'm glad I was exposed to it. So that was very hard Pentecostal Christianity. However, my father would always say he wasn't a Christian. And this really was because of his experience of Christianity growing up in St. Thomas, Jamaica, and how certain ideologies were forced upon him. And it was only some years after his death, unfortunately, my father passed away when I was 10 years old, that I came to learn that he was more interested in and connected to the practice of kumina. In fact, it was the former lead singer of the reggae band Black Roots, Delroy Ogilvie, otherwise known as Charlie, who would tell me about my father's interest in kumina. And Charlie himself would often take a trip back to Jamaica to record some of the singers. I also found out that my father, who came over in the 70s and no doubt had contacts with what we would now term the Windrush generation, people who'd come before him to the UK or the US. And I'm sure he would get those stories back home of how great things were and how amazing it was over here and how he should join. So whatever spurred my father to leave Jamaica, he decided he would, and eventually, as I said, he came to settle in Bristol, but he was in London before, and I guess that's why his nicknames were London and Brixton. My father, as I described, was a proud African man born in Jamaica, and I make that point because certainly through my lifetime and through the 80s, it was not a given connection between Africa or being African and being Jamaican. We were often told that there was a rift between the two. I'm glad to say now, certainly myself and my children understand the connection and understand that we are African heritage people. So when my father came with all his hopes, ambitions for his life here, to make a life, he was met with a very, very harsh reality and certainly probably not the stories that had been coming back to him. We all know now, or most of us should do, the posters that were spread around the UK, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, no gypsies. Well, that was in terms of accommodation, but it also cut across to work. And that was what my father faced. However, my father, with his pride and his determination, tenacity, vision, he really kept pushing, but he had to hustle his way to make a living and to hustle his way into society. And this is where my father worked really hard, and in some ways in things that we wouldn't really deem necessarily acceptable sometimes. My father was a great man, but he was also a gambler. But we can also consider that gambling for some people may have been their only way in some of their minds due to the circumstances they found themselves in to actually get ahead or get a significant amount of money, and it was a risk some of them were willing to take. Equally, my father also brought other practices of his culture with him from Jamaica. Some of this, in some ways, added to his demise, and he did die relatively young at the age of 59. due in part to being a workaholic, also drinking the rum here and there, the gambling, which can be a stressful profession. And my father also smoked. My father was a ganja smoker. And when we think of ganja, which again is a herb and also part of our heritage, the herbalism, understanding the connection with nature, plants, was very, very integral to my father's culture coming from rural Jamaica, where pharmaceuticals did not exist at that time, certainly not in his life and his circle. It was always the knowledge passed down from the elders about how to use plants and how to work with nature to heal. We could also go back to consider how herbs like ganja came to Jamaica, which was with the indentured Indians who had some of them had combined using herbs with their spiritual and religious beliefs. That spread through Jamaica and also informed religions like Rastafari. So my father brought that with him as well. And I think it's significant because we can see that as a cultural practice. But again, coming here, it was something that was essentially outlawed and was used as a weapon against the black community by the police, by the establishment. And that is, I would guess, common knowledge to a lot of people. So, my father, in the end, was able to create his dream. His first dream was to have a child, probably a son, but I was born, and he was very, very happy. And it really pushed him more in his determination to make it in life. And he then realised his second ambition, which was to open a Jamaican restaurant. And Jamaican good food was opened in the 80s in St. Paul's and attracted a wide range of clientele and was very, very successful. One other part of this story is about who I am today and my activism, my strength, my beliefs, my determination to find my African roots and my African traditional practice. And again, I have to thank my father for that. In the 80s, I would go to the restaurant with my sister on the weekends, and we'd usually go to Enterprise taxis and get a taxi home afterwards back to Easton. But there was one occasion where my father actually decided to walk me home. My sister wasn't there that week. He walked me home, which I found very unusual. And as we walked, we stopped at what was the Hummingbird Bookshop. His restaurant is located on Ashley Road, Lower Ashley Road, and Hummingbird is still on Grosvenor Road. The building is still there. He walked me to the bookshop, and the lady who worked there, and again, it was a bookshop I visited quite regularly as a child, gave my father a massive brown envelope. And I thought this was very strange. And then we continued to walk towards home, towards Easton, stopping at where is now St. Paul's Adventure Playground in St. Agnes. My father stopped and he handed me this huge, quite heavy brown paper bag and said to me, "When you're old enough to understand, read this." And it did seem quite ominous at the time. Obviously went home, opened the bag, found the book. And the book was Black Americana, which charted the history of enslavement by the Portuguese to modern day America. And it was seeing this particular image see that? That really struck a chord with me at age, I think I must have been about 9 years old. And that has led me to be someone who's campaigned towards reparations. So I really want to conclude this roundabout story that I hope was interesting for you, to conclude by saying My personal history is long and wide, and there's many things to it, and there's much more I need to learn. But through my father, his understanding of kumina, traditional practice, his being rooted in the sense of rebellion, justice, is something that's travelled down to me. And I have to thank my father for overcoming all the obstacles that were thrown in his way when he came over to the UK so that I could be here today.